Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 29 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to take a look at things through a redraft lens instead of Dynasty like we normally do, and dig into players that can finish number one at their position for the 2024 fantasy season. Now, of course, this will still be very helpful for Dynasty purposes, but given that it's mid-August and your redraft leagues are probably getting ready to draft, I figured this would be a good, timely episode to throw into the mix. So before we do that, though, I just want to remind everyone, as always, if you've missed any of our previous shows, you can find them on any platform that carries podcasts. We're on everything out there, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Amazon, you name it, we're there. Go give us a follow, leave us a 5-star review. That way you don't miss any future episodes, and those reviews certainly help our show out, so we appreciate that. And if you're on social media, go give us a follow on Twitter, at Dynasty War Room. You can subscribe on YouTube at the same handle, and we even have a Facebook page, so you can go like our Dynasty War Room Facebook page as well. So with all that being said, let's just jump right into today's show. And with this focus on players that can finish at number one at their position, I'm going to give you sort of the very obvious names, but I'm also going to, what I'm really going to discuss are the Darkhorse players that can make the leap to finish at number one. So this is sort of the high ceiling type of players, and those are really who we seek out in fantasy to try to, maximize those points on a weekly basis. There are going to be some guys mentioned that are probably a little bit more boom bust, but that is the nature of the game. We're talking as if these players were to hit their boom potential, reach their ceilings. How are they going to help you win your fantasy championships this fall? So with that all being said, let's just start off with the quarterbacks. And I think that there are really four kind of obvious names that are going to the top of draft boards at the quarterback position. So Josh Allen, who has done it routinely over the last few years, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, and Lamar Jackson. Those are probably your big four. But if we want to talk about dark horse candidates to finish number one at the quarterback position in 2024, I've got two names. So we'll start with Anthony Richardson, who's going off the board as QB6 in redraft leagues on Sleeper. And Anthony Richardson, entering his second year in the league, he's kind of like a superhuman. He's just this huge guy, fast, physical, can do it all. The passing game has been a bit of a question mark, but from what we've seen in the NFL, in his very limited sample size before he got hurt, was that he can be very effective and is certainly an elite fantasy option when healthy. So last season, he started and finished only 3 games. So through those 3 games, he averaged a little over 23 points per game, which would have been second in the entire NFL last season, behind only Josh Allen, who finished with 24.2 points per game, and of course was the number one overall quarterback in fantasy football. So that's, pretty good company there for Anthony Richardson. He's got that high rushing ability. He can run for touchdowns. He can run for 100 yards a game. I mean, this is a guy that can do it on the ground. Obviously, there's a little bit of concern about the injury to the shoulder. Is he going to run as much? Is he going to learn to, protect himself, slide a little bit more? That's what we hope. We hope that we'll see the sliding and that he can, prevent himself from being injured by kind of reducing some of those injury risks and taking those hits. But from what we've seen, what we've heard from the coaching staff, they're going to let him run. There was a quote earlier this offseason from the Colts coaching staff that, hey, they're not going to limit his ability to run the ball when it's one of his biggest strengths. So he's got really strong offensive coaching with Shane Steichen. So that is certainly exciting for a fantasy perspective. And he's got a good receiver room. Michael Pittman comes back after a strong season. There's Adonai Mitchell joins the team as a rookie. Josh Downs a little bit banged up, but gives them a good option in the slot. And then Jonathan Taylor in the running game. So this is a pretty good offense, solid offensive line. I think that people across the fantasy industry are catching on to the Anthony Richardson hype. He's been a pretty popular, sleeper breakout name throughout the offseason. So I'm probably not alone in this, but if you're looking for somebody outside that top group of, players, those top 4 quarterbacks that can just truly take over a dynasty or redraft league and you're weak, this is the guy. So Anthony Richardson going off the board at QB6. He's the first Darkhorse quarterback that can finish at number 1 overall at his position in 2024. Now, our second quarterback name is going to be Kyler Murray of the Arizona Cardinals. He's being drafted as the quarterback 9 on Sleeper, and this is someone that he's fully healthy. He's back from injury, and he's got elite weapons now at wide receiver and tight end between Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride. The Cardinals have a pretty rough defense still, so it's going to be a situation where they're going to have to rely on their offense to keep them in games. And this is something where, from a fantasy perspective, we do appreciate these bad defenses for multiple reasons. One, it certainly helps opposing teams put up strong fantasy weeks against the Cardinals, but for the Cardinals offense, they got to score to keep up. So they play in the NFC West with some other very high-powered offenses. Should be a very strong division. And Kyler Murray, he can run the ball. We've seen that. He averaged 18.9 points per game last year, and he's been a very consistent fantasy producer over the years. And so if he can finally take that, sort of consistent top 10 type of fantasy player and put it all together with, finally having elite options, new coaching staff, they're in their second year there in Arizona. So I expect big things from Kyler Murray. He certainly will be a target for me in redraft. And at QB9, I think that is really good value. If you're able to stack up, high-level players at running back and wide receiver and then get Kyler Murray later on in the draft, I think that's a very good strategy. And, there's some high potential there for Kyler Murray. So Anthony Richardson, Kyler Murray, the 2 quarterbacks that I view as dark horse candidates to finish at number 1. But I will say, we have gotten very good as a fantasy community at predicting quarterback scoring. And so while it certainly is in the realm of possibilities for these 2 players, I do think that the safe bet, of course, would be for one of those big 4 names. And just to give you my personal pick of who's going to finish number 1 in scoring at the quarterback position, I do think it will be Josh Allen again. I know that's kind of the boring take, but he's been number 1 year after year for a reason. But also, don't be surprised if we see a bit of a Patrick Mahomes bounce back. Kind of had a down year for fantasy last year, but with some new offensive weapons, I do expect him to jump back up and be in that top 3. So there you have it for the quarterbacks. Let's move on over to running back, where, especially when you talk redraft, running back is still sort of the ultimate, key to your team. Right? You want to have strong running backs. There's certainly been a push in recent years to go more in the wide receiver heavy direction early in drafts. And I think that's continuing to be the trend, which I think is actually pretty good for building teams this year. If you want to have a good, pick up some good value in the draft at running back, I think that given the shift to wide receivers, that is now a little bit more possible than it was, 5 years ago, where you'd see 10 of the first 12 picks, 20 of the first 24 picks all be running backs. I mean, you'd see every running back worth anything would be gone 2 rounds in. I don't think we see that anymore because people are catching on to the fact that, wide receivers are very valuable, a little bit more, safe when it comes to injuries and, big weeks, things like that. The shift into full PPR leagues or 3 wide receiver leagues. So, everything depends on your league structure, but kind of back to the main focus here with the running backs that can finish at number 1 overall. To me, there are 3 very obvious names. Christian McCaffrey, of course. He is the 101 in most drafts, although I do think that now, given the injury that he's been dealing with in the preseason, that I would not fault anyone for taking CeeDee Lamb or Tyreek Hill first overall in a fantasy football draft this fall. So with that being said, though, McCaffrey is still the clear and obvious choice to be the number 1 overall scorer at the running back position. So he is there. Breece Hall, who was number 2 last year, and then Bijan Robinson entering his sophomore season in the NFL. So those are the big 3. But other than those 3 players, I see a number of different running backs, certainly more than at quarterback, players that can actually reach that number 1 for the position. So we'll start. I've got, 5 names here. So, and I do think that this is because the running back position does tend to be a little bit more, up and down. It's not as predictable. There are, more injuries, things like that. Whereas, wide receiver and quarterback, I think is a little bit easier to predict who in fact will be at the top of the position. But my first player that I want to mention here is, as my dark horse running backs to finish number 1 is Saquon Barkley, who is being drafted as the RB6 in redraft. And he heads over to Philadelphia from New York. So he's on a much better offense, just a much better team overall. There is no competition in the running back room in Philly. I mean, we're talking, rookies and Will Shipley, or Kenneth Gainwell is still there. I mean, nobody that's going to be taking carries away from Saquon. To me, the competition for backfield touches on the Eagles is Jalen Hurts. As a running quarterback, we've seen the tush push where he gets those short touchdowns. So that certainly will factor in and potentially cap his touchdown upside. But I also believe that he should end up scoring more touchdowns being on a much better offense than he was with the Giants, where he really wasn't scoring that many touchdowns as it was in New York. So last season, he was running back 9 in points per game. I think he can improve on that. And given the, just the better situation, as long as he stays healthy, which is, of course, always the big question, both with Saquon and then the running back position as a whole, I think he really should be an elite running back option in redraft. I've been excited to add him in Dynasty as well, given the contract he signed with Philadelphia. I think he could potentially be one of those rare players where he doesn't just fall off a cliff in his age, 27, 28 season. So a little bit more runway for Dynasty. And but for redraft, though, I'm very excited about Saquon. And I think at RB6, that is a very good, fair and good value at the same time. And he certainly has a chance to be number 1 at the position. Next up, we have Kyren Williams, who is a pretty controversial pick this year. He really broke onto the scene last year, was awesome for fantasy, missed a decent amount of time with injuries, but he did finish as the running back 2 in points per game last year, and it was by a pretty substantial gap. So he averaged 21.3 points per game last year, and the difference between second and third was 21.3 versus 17.9. So that's a pretty big gap between the running back 2 and 3 in points per game. Trailing only Christian McCaffrey, who had, I think it was 23 or 24 points per game, which kind of just speaks to how insane Christian McCaffrey is for fantasy. But Kyren Williams is someone that if he is able to maintain a similar workload, and I don't expect it to be something where he's just a complete bell cow, because they did draft Blake Corum, so Corum is going to see the field, but if Williams can stay efficient, he's going to be catching passes, he's going to get a lot of red zone opportunities and a good offense with a non-running quarterback. As long as it doesn't turn into like a full-time 50-50 committee, which I don't expect, at least I certainly don't expect that in 2024. Now, depending on how things go, we'll have another conversation next year about 2025. But for 2024 in redraft, we've seen him do it on the field. I mean, 21 points per game is no joke. He's a strong pass catcher. We've talked about this being a good offense. So it really kind of comes down to your belief in how they're going to use Williams and Corum. So, I, being a Michigan fan, saw a ton of Blake Corum, obviously, through his college career. So we've seen the impact that he can have on a running game, and that's why I expect him to be in the field. We've seen nothing but, good comments, or heard nothing but good comments about Corum so far this summer. But Kyren Williams was, this wasn't a situation where he was some, solid but, mediocre fantasy producer or even just regular NFL producer in the field. We were talking about a really good running back by NFL standards last season. I really think that Corum is going to be in there to sort of help protect Williams' health, which if he stays healthy for the full season, running back 1 could certainly be in the cards. Now, another guy who is a little controversial for different reasons, same sort of competition issue where there's another running back in the backfield, but one that is aging out as opposed to a rookie. And so the next running back that I think can finish at number 1 is Devon Achane, and he's being drafted and redrafted as the running back 10 on Sleeper. And this is the ultimate boom-bust running back. I mean, this is someone that had a 50-point game last year, but he did have multiple games where he was under 5 points. But even with those 3 games under 5 points and battling the injuries and everything else throughout the season, he still finished 5th in points per game. So he's in a crowded backfield. There is, they drafted Jalen Wright. They still have Mostert. And Raheem Mostert is somebody that, despite being in the 30s, he was a top fantasy running back last year. So I think that shows you that, look, this Miami backfield is going to be good for fantasy. We saw it last season. Mostert had a zillion touchdowns. And if Devon Achane can come in, number 1, stay healthy. It's kind of the repeating theme here. But if he can stay healthy and be on the field a solid amount, we're talking about somebody that doesn't need to be a bell cow. He doesn't need to get 70, 80% of the carries. He just has to get, 40 to 50% of the carries, and he can be a really, really good fantasy option. So while it is a crowded backfield, I'm not necessarily scared away. I think this will just come down to the particular league you're in and sort of your tolerance level for risk, because I do think that Devon Achane is somebody that is extraordinarily risky and could backfire in a huge way. However, I do think that is largely due to injury and him being undersized. But if we're just expecting guys to stay healthy, Achane is absolutely somebody that can take over a game, just win you a week. And because he is so efficient on his touches, so even if he's only getting 10 to 15 touches, he's going to be able to catch passes. I mean, this is somebody that the ceiling is sky high. And so that is why he can finish at number 1 at the running back position in 2024. Next up, we have Isaiah Pacheco, who's being drafted as running back 12. And this is, a bit of an outside pick. I don't think that there's a lot of people that believe that Pacheco truly has running back 1 in his range of outcomes. But I'll say this about Pacheco, and the reason that I am a big believer in him in 2024, this is, one of the best offenses in the league. I expect them to be better in 2024 than they were last season, which, is saying something given that they did, win the Super Bowl. But he's got no competition. There's no Jerick McKinnon that's being pesky, taking away receiving work. Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Carson Steele and Deneric Prince, these backup running backs that are kind of rotating in a little bit here in the preseason and whatnot. I really don't expect this to be a situation where anyone is taking substantial work away from Pacheco. So I think that he's going to improve on his 205 carries that he had last season. We've seen other kind of similar running backs get 250 to 275 carries. Along with, potentially an increase in the passing game work as well. I expect him to exceed 50 receptions. So this is someone that he has been very good. He's going to score touchdowns. He's on, the Chiefs offense. There's going to be touchdowns available. But if he can simply improve his volume, which I expect, I think we're talking, a running back with top 5, top 6 upside that if things break right, and this truly is, one of the league's top couple, top 2, top 3 offenses, Isaiah Pacheco could certainly be in the conversation to be number 1 at the position. All right, and then moving on to our last running back, kind of an old head at the position that's been around for a while, but he's been just a reliable, consistent, awesome fantasy producer for years, and that is Alvin Kamara, and he's being drafted as the running back 16 on Sleeper and Redraft. And this is sort of an interesting scenario because Kendre Miller is still banged up. He's had those hamstring injuries, hasn't done anything really in the preseason. And so the New Orleans offense should run completely through Alvin Kamara. I mean, there's going to be a lot of dump-off passes, and he already had 75 catches last year, and that was missing the first few games of the season due to suspension. So this year, there's no injury, no suspension. He was third in points per game last season, and if he's able to stay on the field for a full season, and this, it's a bad team. The Saints are going to be bad. Derek Carr is not a good quarterback. Chris Olave is the only other real weapon in the passing game, and so I expect Kamara to get a ton of work. And even though he may not be as efficient as he once was when he was, being a first-round pick in fantasy football, he's going to have the volume to, maybe make up for that. And so I think that at running back 16, he's a steal in redraft and is kind of a buy low veteran for Dynasty that, should absolutely help your fantasy team and is not going to cost you a first-round pick to do so. So there's the running backs, and like I did with quarterbacks, and I'll do this for the other positions as well, but my pick for to finish number one, of course, is Christian McCaffrey. And I think the general caveat with this question of dark horse candidates to finish at number one, with running backs, I think this would entirely depend on McCaffrey getting hurt. Which we've seen already. So we've seen that multiple times in the past, of course, but with the calf injury here in the summer, there's definitely some concern there. I really don't like drafting players that have been banged up over the summer, particularly in August in redraft. I think that just carries a ton of risk. We see, those re-injuries throughout the season all the time. And so I'm a little bit worried about Christian McCaffrey. However, if he plays, at least 15, 16 games, he's going to be the running back one. He's just that good. He's so much better than everyone else. But all of these other names, I think, should give you some pretty good value. And should there be an injury situation for McCaffrey, would absolutely be in the mix to be the running back one overall. All right, so let's move on over to wide receiver, where I actually think pretty much, like quarterback, and I've mentioned this, but it's so difficult to pick somebody to be number one that's not already kind of in that top 4 to 5 players at the position because we've gotten so good at predicting production from wide receivers. And so to me, there are the top 5 very obvious and clear choices to finish number one, and that's CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamar Chase, and Justin Jefferson. So those are your big 5 in redraft. But if we want to discuss, dark horse players to finish number one, as this episode is about, I'm going to start. I have 3 players, and one is a bit of a stretch, so we'll save that for last. But my first player that I want to talk about is Nico Collins. So he's being drafted as the wide receiver 15, and he is, paired with C.J. Stroud. He's the number one receiver there, and Stroud entering the second year in the NFL. The Houston Texans have a really strong offense. We're talking about an elite young quarterback, 3 good receivers. I think that we can debate about what Stephon Diggs has left in the tank, but I'm very much focused on Nico Collins, both in Dynasty and in redraft from this Texans offense. I also prefer Tank Dell over Diggs, but not to turn this into a let's hate on Diggs episode. We'll stick to Nico Collins, and he was the wide receiver 7 in points per game last year. He broke out. I mean, this was his big breakout season. He also had 3 30-plus fantasy point weeks, which, those are the win you a week type of performances that can raise a receiver up to be a number one overall type of guy. And so now that connection has truly been established, there's no, wondering about what Stroud is going to be like. And it's boom, first week on, everyone has high expectations. The offense should be humming, ready to go. There's no learning curve. And So I'm expecting big things from Nico Collins. I think that wide receiver 15 has potential to be a steal, and that is because of the ambiguity in the receiver room between Collins, Dell, and Diggs. So I will happily take my shot on the guy that I believe in the most. And should things go right and Houston's offense take that next step, we're talking about one of the better teams and offenses in the league. And I think that certainly gives Nico Collins the chance to be the number one overall wide receiver. All right, now next up is another old reliable, and I wish we could say that about his quarterback, but Davante Adams, who's being drafted as the wide receiver 9, and he's into his 30s now. We're talking about an older player, but he's been around. He's done it year after year after year, and in his 2 seasons with Vegas, he has topped 175 targets both years. And now he's got Gardner Minshew as his new starting quarterback. They just announced that. And Minshew did support Michael Pittman last year with the Colts. And I think that this is a quarterback upgrade. I mean, we're talking about coming from a Jimmy Garoppolo and Aiden O'Connell team last year. And Adams still had the 175 targets, still had a 1,000-yard season, still was one of the best receivers in the league. So if the quarterback situation is just marginally better in 2024, I think we're in line for another, 175 targets, another 100 catches, 1,500 yards, double-digit touchdowns. I mean, we're talking about the possibility of him, being the number one overall receiver. And I think it might even be more, probable that Adams is in this mix than Collins, or certainly our next player. But, that's why he's being drafted as the wide receiver 9. Now, from a dynasty perspective, we're talking about somebody that you can probably get for a second-round pick. I mean, I don't know that many people are going to want to give up a first-round pick for a, receiver in his 30s who plays on a bad team. So if you're a contender and you want to get, one more guy to add to your starting lineup, I think Adams is a great option to go after. Now, there's certainly some downside and some risk here. Given the age, being, I think he's 31, the drop-off does come fast for older wide receivers. So you just kind of have to be aware that, look, you could be in line for this awesome season at potentially a discount, or, he could fall off the cliff and, you're just left holding the bag with an older receiver. So it's easier, I think, to palette that in redraft, which is why I have him on this list, and just being someone that truly does have that ability to jump into the number one overall conversation. Now, the third player that I want to bring up at wide receiver, and it's DJ Moore, who is being drafted as the wide receiver 19. So to finish as the number 1 would obviously be a pretty big surprise to the to the fantasy community. And so I will admit that this is absolutely a stretch, and this may be a bit of internal bias because I have DJ Moore on a number of teams, but he was the wide receiver 6 last year with Justin Fields. So on the downside, he has more competition at receiver with Rome Odunze and Keenan Allen, and rookie quarterbacks, really rarely produce wide receiver 1s in fantasy. But at the same time, this is a very unique situation with Caleb Williams. I mean, Caleb Williams has looked unbelievable in the preseason so far. He's the most hyped quarterback since probably Trevor Lawrence and then Andrew Luck before him. So we're talking about, a high-level quarterback coming in as a rookie. The team is clearly his. The offense has looked solid. I mean, DJ Moore being wide receiver 6 last year with Justin Fields is like kind of an insane thing to think about as is. I mean, Justin Fields was not a very good passer. And so the fact that he was able to support DJ Moore, I think gives me a lot of hope for what Caleb Williams can do in the same, offense. So Moore just got the big contract. I think he's clearly the wide receiver 1 there. And I do think that the offense will be better overall. So it could be a situation where, the offense is better and Moore still has a very good season, but maybe the ceiling is not quite there because of the added competition. But, if things go well and Caleb Williams, is as good as everyone thinks he is, I don't think it's out of the question that DJ Moore can kind of break some of those barriers and that Caleb Williams can break the mold and support a high-level fantasy wide receiver. Now, in terms of who I think will actually finish number one overall at the position, to me, it's a two-horse race between CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill, which, again, is the easy, obvious choice, but those two players are being drafted in the top 3 of the first round for a reason. So I don't really think you can go wrong. I think my personal pick right now is probably Tyreek Hill. I give him the very slight edge, but again, you can't go wrong. It's a true coin flip there with CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill. I think I'll lean Hill for now just because I think he's potentially the safer option in drafts with the whole contract situation with CeeDee Lamb. I won't be overly worried about a holdout situation affecting games till we reach, Labor Day weekend, but just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind that, hey, if you have the number 1, number 2 overall pick in your draft and you don't want to take risks in the first round of your redraft league, your draft. And so Tyreek Hill, I think even if he is the number 2 or the number 3 wide receiver in the year, I think you will feel pretty good about that. And that way you don't have to sweat out this contract situation between CeeDee Lamb and the Cowboys. All right, so moving on over to tight end, our last position of the day. And to me, it's a tough position to sort of pick out dark horse candidates because I think anyone in the top 6 or 7 at the position could certainly be the number 1 tight end. It's just a little bit more fluid of a position compared to past years where it was always just Travis Kelce. But I think that kind of the 3 obvious veterans, well, the 2 veterans really, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews certainly could be in the mix. And then Sam Laporta, who entering his second year in the NFL was the number 1 overall tight end last season. So I do, of course, have to include him in that top 3 of kind of the obvious picks. So I have 3 other tight ends that I absolutely think could finish as the number 1 overall tight end. And Trey McBride is the first, and he could very easily belong in sort of the slam dunk obvious group with Laporta, Kelce, and Andrews. And he's being drafted as the tight end 3. So people are very high on McBride, myself included. And he really broke out at the end of last season. He had a really strong year. He had a good connection with Kyler Murray after he returned from injury. As I talked about when we discussed Kyler Murray, this is a really strong offense, one that I expect to be one of the much improved offenses in the league, potentially top 10. And he's going to have some help on offense now, too. I mean, Marvin Harrison Jr. Might demote Trey McBride to the number 2 option in the passing game, but if this offense is as good as I'm expecting it to be, we're talking about 2 guys that should, easily still get their targets, still get their catches. I'm not that worried about one taking away from the other. If anything, I think it will make it easier for the offense to work and to generate more scoring opportunities, which, of course, will benefit everyone on this Cardinals offense. So he was drafted in the second round to be great. He's shown that he's on that path, and I fully expect him to be elite this year. And I think he's my pick to finish number 2 in redraft scoring. So very high ceiling for Trey McBride. I'm very excited about him in that Arizona offense. And so he is the first pick for me as dark horse candidates to finish at number 1 at the tight end position in 2024. Now my next pick is Evan Engram, who is being drafted as the tight end 8, which honestly blows my mind in redraft. I mean, I can understand it a little bit more in Dynasty if you're worried about somebody who is, about to enter their 30s, and you don't want to, invest in that for a first round pick or whatnot. But in redraft, I mean, we're talking about the tight end 2 from last year, and he was still a top 5 tight end in points per game last season. And so I think people just either don't realize it or they just kind of assume, it's the Jaguars, Trevor Lawrence was only okay last year. Evan Ingram, they have Brian Thomas, all these things. So I just don't see it that way. I think that the Jaguars offense is in line for a big bounce back year. I think that Trevor Lawrence is going to be a much improved quarterback. He's one of my favorite redraft and dynasty targets at the quarterback position. So I think that the touchdown rate should correct itself. He was, pretty below the league average last year, but I think that he can jump back up at least to the league average in his touchdown percentage. And so that will help Evan Ingram, who already was catching a ton of passes. So if you're in a full PPR league, especially, or tight end premium, Evan Ingram is, probably the perfect tight end to have because he's not going to cost you a ton, but he catches a ton of passes and he's still a red zone threat. He can score, do it all on the field. So I'm a big Evan Ingram guy. I have him on a number of different teams and I will be targeting him again in redraft. So while I expect him to potentially be the number 2 target behind Christian Kirk, I do not expect Brian Thomas to just take all of Calvin Ridley's targets. There are targets to be had in this offense. And so, especially if there's, any time during the year where Kirk misses a game or two due to injury, Brian Thomas probably going to take some time to get up to speed. There's really just no reason that Evan Ingram can't be a PPR machine again in 2024. So to me, that makes him a dark horse candidate to finish as the tight end 1 overall. And last but not least, a player that has been hyped up, potentially more than anyone else in the fantasy space over the last few seasons, and that is Kyle Pitts, who's being drafted and redrafted as the tight end 6 on Sleeper. And would anyone really be shocked if Kyle Pitts was the number 1 tight end? I mean, I would not be. He has all the talent in the world. He showed that in his rookie year when he had over 1,000 yards, but he's been very disappointing since. I mean, he's been a little bit banged up. He's had terrible quarterback play, but he finally gets that upgrade with Kirk Cousins. And so the makings are there for a tight end 1 season, and he's being drafted sort of in a kind of hedging their bets at tight end 6. It's still fairly high, but not high enough that you're breaking the bank in a redraft league to acquire him. So he's a popular pick this offseason. I just traded him away in a dynasty league for what I felt was just an offer I couldn't say no to. So I received Zay Flowers, Kyron Williams, and Josh Palmer in return for Kyle Pitts and a 3rd-round pick. So to me, that was a slam dunk sort of trade that I had to make, even though I believe in Kyle Pitts. It was just too much value to give up. But in redraft, you're certainly not getting any sort of offers like that, of course. And so this could be the big year for him. It's finally a year where there's not an obvious number 1 overall. Travis Kelce, I think, we'll just get to that now. I think Travis Kelce is going to be the number 1 overall tight end again, reclaiming his throne from Sam Laporta, but I don't think it's as obvious or clear as it's been in the past. This is not something where it's just a battle for number 2 or, hey, can Mark Andrews stay healthy? It's a bit more ambiguous across the board. So it's there for the taking. Kyle Pitts has the opportunity. He kind of needs to show that he is one of the league's best tight ends because he hasn't hasn't really done much since that rookie season. So we'll see what he brings to the table, but he is certainly a dark horse candidate to finish as the number 1 overall tight end in 2024. And all right, that's all there is to today's show. I just wanted to, touch on some of the high-end players that have high ceilings. And next week, I think we're going to bring up the My Guys. So just talk about my favorite players for this upcoming season. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all very much for listening. As always, this is the Dynasty War Room podcast, and we will talk to you all next week.